Hey, everybody.
Hello.
These are hard acts to follow. The vet, the cop firefighter, the bartender,
What else?
the walking professor. I'm a reporter, but now I'm a professor, but mostly I'm a procrastinator. So when John said, come tell a story, I thought, oh, John has such good people. Isn't that nice? I got no stories to tell. But isn't that nice that John asked me to tell a story, so I'll figure something out. But I didn't really finish it, you know? Because I got other stuff and I'm a procrastinator. So bear with me. It's not so tightly, nicely all together. Now I need these. Do you ever read Trinity by Leon Uris? It's one of those fat 1970s paperbacks from when people read for entertainment. The cover is a tricolor. It opens with a meticulously drawn geography of a village on Lough Donegal. A church perched on a hillside, churchyard stacked full of gravestones, and the land sweeping down to the Foyle, the wee road running up from Derry beside it. My mother's parents were both born in that village. They met in Brooklyn. Pull the lens out a tad further than Leon did, where the graveyard slopes down at an erosion-vulnerable pitch, and there's a stucco cottage, 2 rooms. My grandfather was born in that cottage. He left in 1924, which is suddenly 100 years ago. Well, okay. Who am I putting on airs? He wasn't born in the cottage. He was born in a hole in the ground that was there before the cottage. A dugout. Great view, though. He and his parents and a bunch of brothers and sisters lived in the dugout until his mother and 3 or 4 sisters died of something all at once. Scarlet fever, TB, Spanish flu. Well, they didn't die in the hole in the ground. All I know is that they died outside, in the yard. And then my grandfather and my Uncle Mike, who were wee boys when their mammy died, outside, in the yard. And they called their father a hard man and a bad man for making that so. He was older, old McTaggart was. Irish, retired British Army pensioner, who got this plot of land far too small and far too steep to plant, and took a young wife, and had these several children, some number of whom died. And Jenny, an older daughter, went to America, and Johnny, the oldest boy, went to Scotland, and wee Joe, my granddad, and Mike ended up on opposite sides of the Civil War. And after Mike was banished to America by the mean little free state country, Joe followed. He left this hillside with his hole. There was one more brother. He left it to James. My grandfather said, sure, it's yours, James. Here's us off to America. And Johnny's in Scotland already with a life and a wife. He had no right to bequeath that hole in the ground, him being a younger son. But also, it was a hole in the ground. That cottage. We stand and look at that cottage every time we go to Donegal. Those plastic family photo albums in my parents' house. My dad has them stacked year by year. Every couple of years, there's a picture of us in stripy 1970s shirts and in pastel 80s shirts and in 1990s steeped cuffs, standing next to that cottage, looking at it. Every time we go to Donegal, we look at that cottage. But actually, the cottage was built by James's son in the 1960s before he too left for America. But we go and we stand and we look at it. Here's what I know about my grandfather Joe in America. He was in Brooklyn in some apartment above Prospect Park with a pile of lads. And he had whatever jobs he had until he became an elevator operator at the Bell Labs in Manhattan. It's a big building. It's still there. It takes up a whole block in Chelsea. Joe McTaggart went to school in that little village in Ireland until the 4th grade. And then he worked. And then he came to America, and he got this job. Like all you guys who spoke, it was union. Eventually, he was a manager. My mother always said that. Your grandfather was a manager at the Bell Labs. And I always thought, of what? He wasn't a chemist with his 4th grade degree. He was a supervisor, eventually, of 300 elevator operators and other service people. This was the house that my grandfather built in Flushing. This is when John's going to go to the other toilet. This is the house that my grandfather bought in Flushing. He bought it in 1936 or 1937. He paid, thanks to Acris, I know this, $5,000. My aunt remembers them having a party and burning the mortgage when they paid off that $5,000. As an elevator and operator in 1940, he made $2,000 a year. I found the 1940 census record. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, you probably didn't think I was going to mention the Bureau of Labor Statistics. But you're lucky. I am. According to the Bureau of Labor Statistics, that's the equivalent of $46,000 in today's money. $2,000 in 1940 is about 46 grand today. In the late 50s, the elevator operators went on strike. They actually went on strike a bunch of times during the war, after the war, up into the 60s. They were out for months. This I just learned recently. Joe McTaggart was a supervisor by then, management. But he went out with them. He was management. He wasn't in the union anymore, he was management. But he went out on strike with them. And my grandmother went and worked in a department store to pay the mortgage. A few years later, he had a heart attack. And back then, you know, now you have a heart attack, they'll bump you out the door 20 minutes later, but back then when you had a heart attack, you were home on your back for ages. He was out for 3 months at least. By then, my aunt had finished high school and was in the mailroom at the company, and she went in to work with her father on his first day back. And all the workers, not the chemists or the engineers maybe, but all the workers, the elevator operators and the maintenance and the operations guys, they all lined up. All the way across the marble lobby and up the stairs like an honor guard to welcome him back. Because he'd gone out with them, even though he was management. I think about that. The life in this country, the life he could have. Because enough people went out for each other. Didn't put each other out in the yard. Went out. That American homeowner thing, sometimes it's flattened to my piece of the frontier. I got mine and let me close the gate behind me. But that's not actually how it worked. Or has to. Wages and houses used to move together. The house has been owned by a few people since my grandparents left. It's gone up in value. In 2022, it sold for $940,000.
Wow.
Guys like Joe McTaggart don't live there anymore. Someone would have to make $375,000 a year to have an equivalent deal to what my grandfather had with his $5,000 house on a $2,000 salary. Wages have gone up since 1940, but not like housing has. The BLS says that the average weekly wage in Queens is $1,200 these days. That's a little more than 66 grand a year. But for somebody like my grandfather, without a high school degree, the salary is lower, closer to about $40,000. The guy today who's like my grandfather, left a country torn apart, almost no education, from a rural agricultural place, he ain't never gonna have a house. A place for his kids to sit in a little yard. Why'd we let that happen? I didn't know my grandfather at all. He died 10 years before I was born. But I think about him every time I see one of these new Senegalese kids on the street, the age he and Mike were when they got here. Or when I run into the parents of my kids' classmates. Victor walked here from Mexico when he was 15. My son, Hugh, was deeply in love with his daughter when he was in kindergarten. I think he kind of almost got over it by about 3rd grade. Anyway, I like Victor a lot. I'm sort of getting over Jennifer myself. Victor walked here from Mexico when he was 15. I think he said he'd gone to 8th grade in Puebla. He has never not worked. Deli, DoorDash, food packing plant, frozen meals, restaurants. Why did we make it so much harder for him? The dugout on the hillside, dying out in the yard. Or the 2-story home on a leafy street. My knobby-kneed mom roller skating on the sidewalk between neighbors who lived there for 30 years. Stability and days off. Why did we get rid of that?